episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. You know, we've been kind of beating around the bush, I think, long enough on this podcast. I mean, how many times have we talked in recent episodes where we covered cybersecurity-related topics, and then we get to this little-known segment called Insider Threats, and then we're just kind of like, oh yeah, those are a thing, but we're just gonna, like, pretend they don't exist for right now and move on. It's kind of like when you go through high school physics and you do get to like perpetual motion and like the different motion things, and it's like, oh yeah, air resistance is a thing, but we're just going to ignore it. So that's kind of what it is here, but no more, because the reason why insider threats are some of the most difficult cybersecurity risks to detect and mitigate is because they come from trusted individuals inside an organization, or they come from the credentials or the user of a trusted individual inside the organization. Now, other complications is motivations when it comes to insider threats, because they can obviously vary quite drastically between each individual case. It's like a case-by-case thing. Now, there's some like overarching like higher trends that the kind of like you can see like throughout, which we're going to get into, but generally there's a bunch of different ways that insider threats can occur, which is why they're so hard to like try to stop and mitigate. But before we get too deep into that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So this week's trivia question is: a SIM card is an integrated circuit intended to securely store information and key on a mobile phone. But what does SIM in SIM card stand for? So what does SIM in SIM card stand for? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, moving right into this week's cybersecurity tip. Now, I totally understand that this episode is basically a cybersecurity tip in and of itself, seeing it's going over insider threats and whatnot. But I figured I'd throw this one in here anyway, just because it kind of came to me this week. And that is, if you use some kind of personal access token for any of your various accounts, whether that's something like a smart card or a YubiKey or some other kind of like third party like hard token for like your multi-factor, don't leave it plugged into your computer. Because it's basically, it kind of defeats the purpose of the second factor if it's always plugged into the computer or laptop, desktop, whatever. Because it's kind of like the same case where if you have like multi-factor like on your phone, and like your multi-factor, like say you're using something like Duo or Okta or one of those like authenticator apps, and you have it on your phone and you're logging into an account also on your phone, it kind of defeats the point of having the second factor because it's on the same device. Now granted, it's better than nothing obviously, but the problem with leaving like something like a YubiKey or a smart card, plugged into your laptop, desktop, whatever, is if someone were to gain access to your device, they now have access to your second factor as well, and you're kind of cooked there. Now, some of the factors are smart enough where you actually have to input some kind of like PIN or something. So, but I mean, if we're talking about like social engineering here, you're probably doing some sort of like monitor surfing or keyboard surfing or whatever. You're basically kind of looking over the shoulder of someone as they're typing in their passcode or their PIN or whatever for this device, and then the second they step away and walk away and leave their computer, you also know the PIN so you can gain access to it. So basically, if you're not actively using your smart card, YubiKey, whatever, just unplug it from your device, like just unplug it, then it kind of removes the risk factor there. So yeah, that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about was some Apple news that got released or announced, I guess, this week. And I know we totally ignored the fact that the iPhone 16e got announced. What was that, like 2 weeks ago? But in my opinion, that was basically a big nothing burger and kind of boring anyway, which is why I didn't bother talking about it. But this week, we actually have a little more interesting stuff going on because Apple finally listened. I don't know if you can believe it, but they finally listened to us. They heard us whining and complaining back in 2019 when the Intel Mac Pro came out because we had to take out a mortgage in order to get the maxed out version. But now they listened and they were like, yep, we understand that paying, over like $50,000, almost $60,000 for a computer is kind of absurd. So we're just going to dial it back a little bit and make you only have to take out a car payment in order to buy the fully maxed out Mac Studio. Now, granted, a lot of that cost is coming from the storage modules, which, as we're kind of seeing develop, those storage models are basically being reverse engineered, so you can basically buy secondhand storage modules for a lot cheaper and kind of put them in yourself. Now, granted, there is kind of a process that you have to go through to that through like a whole like a DFU restore type thing. But regardless, you can basically buy a Mac and upgrade the storage yourself at a later time if you so choose to, which is pretty cool. We'll have to see if the new Mac Studios kind of fall into the same camp. The M1 and the M2 Mac Studios did fall into this camp, and seeing that it's the same design, I don't see why they wouldn't, but that's something Apple has also done before, where they've kept basically the exact same design and layout of everything, but if you try to like intermingle parts, they just don't work because reasons. But getting into some of these Macs here, so the Mac Studio that got released was very interesting because the Mac Studio got announced with the M4 Max and the M3 Ultra. And you heard me right. I said the M3 Ultra, not the M4 Ultra. Not sure why they decided to make that move because the M3, I mean, I think we all kind of thought that the M3 was done at this point because we've had M4 for a while now. So, not sure why they made this decision. Also, another thing that's kind of peculiar is the M3 Ultra also has Thunderbolt 5 capabilities, which other members of the M3 family did not, which is also rather interesting. Um, so as far as the M3 Ultra goes, you get up to so it's not the base, the binned version, but you get up to 32 CPU cores and 80 GPU cores, and you get up to 512 gigabytes of RAM. Now, can we just appreciate for a second how you can now buy a Mac with unified memory that has two different RAM options that are either larger than or as large as some of the base storage options on a decent number of the other Macs that they sell. It's kind of funny. Now, granted, this isn't the first time that that's happened. Of course, in 2019, when the Intel Mac Pro was announced, you could obviously get that thing with 1.5 terabytes of RAM, which is kind of where you had to take out the mortgage for. But yeah, so now we're back to, but I mean, 512 gigs of unified memory is definitely going to pack a lot more punch than your standard kind of like DIMM modules. But where the money really, you really start to spend the money is one, in those RAM upgrades, but two, in the storage upgrades. Because one thing you have to be mindful of if you're thinking about buying one of these Mac Studios is the upgrades themselves. Like if you want to upgrade, the CPU, or I guess the system on a chip, or the RAM or the storage, depending on which option you want, it also comes with other upgrades as well. So for instance, if you want to like upgrade to the Max chip, you also have to upgrade the RAM and the storage of the thing too. So it kind of like increases the price that way. And they're doing the same thing like they did with the Mac Mini, I think, and some of the MacBook Pros, where like certain configurations of CPU and RAM don't mix for whatever reason. But speaking of storage, I did touch on that. You can now get a whopping 16 terabytes of storage, assuming, of course, you go for the Ultra version. If you are so inclined to spend an extra $4,600. Not sure why you would want to do that, but I mean, I guess if you have money burning a hole in your pocket, more power to you. So that's the Mac Studio. MacBook Air, basically just a spec bump, but I think it's a pretty good spec bump. So Apple previously, how they had their pricing structure for the MacBook Air is they had the previous MacBook Air generation. So, for instance, when they were still selling the M3 MacBook Air, they had the M2 MacBook Air for $999, and then they had the M3 variants for a slightly higher price. But now they've done completely away with that, and the MacBook Air now starts at $999 with the M4 chip. So that is quite nice to see. Now, of course, that's for the 13-inch variant. If you want the 15-inch variant, that starts at $1199. They do have a new sky blue color, which, I mean, I guess that's cool. And the other nice thing is now that 16 gigs of RAM is standard, it's honestly a pretty good value for like $1,000 to get the M4 chip, get 16 gigs of RAM. It's definitely a very serviceable machine in that regard. The only kind of, I guess, caveat is they still have 256 gigs of storage as the base storage, which is kind of rough, and you're going to be paying out the wazoo in order to upgrade that storage. But depending on what your use case is, 256 gigs could potentially be serviceable, depending on what your needs and what your use case is. Like for me personally, if I were to get one of these MacBook Airs, I could definitely make do with 256 gigs of storage because I have a network attached storage in my home lab that has more storage than I could ever dream of needing. So if I did need anything, I could just throw it there. Plus, I also have an external drive enclosure that I've purposely bought for my Mac Mini, but I could easily plug that into the MacBook Air as well. So definitely plenty of options that I have there. But just overall, a very nice spec bump. In the same vein of spec bumps, there's the iPad Air, which there honestly really isn't much here either. It does get the M3 chip because obviously the M2 chip wasn't powerful enough for the iPad. Now, I'm not complaining at all because having the latest, well, I guess at this point it's not the latest and greatest, but having a newer chip is definitely nice to see, and, we'll take those wins. But at the same time, literally nobody is making use of the M series chips in any of the iPads. I mean, let's just be real. But it also does come with Apple Pencil Pro support, which I guess is cool if you had one of those or were thinking about getting one of those. That kind of brings it in line, I think, with some of the newer iPad Pros, which is kind of nice to see. So yeah, those were kind of the main updates. Not too much. It kind of makes sense that this was just a press release and they didn't do an actual event because overall there really isn't a whole lot interesting here. Granted, the M3 Ultra decision was, I think, probably the most interesting thing of the bunch. Why they chose to do that rather than the M4 Ultra. I don't know if maybe this is something I literally just thought of right now, is since they didn't make any changes to the Mac Pro, I'm wondering if they're holding out the M4 Ultra for the Mac Pro line to kind of have more of a distinguishing factor between the Mac Studio and the Mac Pro, because if you'll remember, when the Apple Silicon Mac Pro came out, it was the same basically chip configuration, the M2 Ultra, as you could get in the Mac Studio. So you're basically paying a massive premium for PCIe lanes, I guess. I mean, that was literally like the only difference between the Mac Studio and the Mac Pro. So that would be my guess, is they're saving the M4 Ultra for the Mac Pro, and that's how they're going to kind of distinguish the two. But I mean, I guess only Tim Cook knows about that and the other higher ups at Apple. But with that, I think we can slide right into the main topic of this episode. No nerdy things this week for a couple reasons. It was kind of one of those weeks where you felt like you were constantly doing something and were always busy, yet you really had nothing to show for it? You know, one of those things. Also got sick this week, so that didn't help things either. But yeah, so hopefully we can get back to some nerdy stuff soon, because I have to say I am very much missing not writing some code and playing around with the old home lab, because as one thing that I haven't really mentioned is I got the bare essentials of the home lab reset up, like the hypervisors and whatnot. But I didn't get everything back up, and it has kind of stayed that way since the initial setting up of the home lab. So I got like the main hypervisors and the core infrastructure set up, and then after that, things just kind of fell by the wayside, and like some of my purpose-built like dev machines, like some of my like that one super special Mac that you guys have heard me talk about before, that is still in its box. My other 2012 Mac Mini that I was kind of also using as like a remote Intel dev machine, that's also, well, it doesn't have box, but it's also still hasn't been plugged in yet. So there's still a lot of stuff that needs to happen. But like I said, I've been just really busy with a lot of stuff. It's crazy what happens when you move states. There's a lot of things that you have to do that really sucks up a large amount of your time. But that's neither here nor there. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, which is the insider threats. So I guess first we should start off with what is an insider threat, which the kind of the basic definition is: an insider threat is just basically a risk of any to an organization posed by someone within the organization, whether that's employees of the organization, contractors, business partners, or basically anyone that has access to that corporation or organization's data, resources, you name it. So the reason why this is dangerous, obviously, is insiders have a lot more access to sensitive data and systems, which your typical hacker would have to bypass all different kinds of security measures in order to get the same access. So getting access to the data that you want to get access to is a lot easier if you're already on the inside, hence the term insider threat. Plus, they're a lot harder to detect because some of the actions that insider threats will do can look very much like legitimate activity, like depending on what you're doing and what your role within the company is. Trying to say like exfiltrate data might look basically like any other, Tuesday essentially for a certain employee. Like if you, one of the kind of examples we'll get into is essentially a guy wrote a script to, on intervals, essentially exfiltrate data. And depending on what your use case is inside the company, that might not look like illegitimate traffic. So if you're trying to set up some kind of internal systems to check for these things, you might be able to easily overlook that. Plus, you don't want to have too many false positives and start going after people for not posing insider threats, because then in an ironic twist, that could make them disgruntled and then become an insider threat. So I guess that's one thing to keep in mind, which that kind of actually brings up a good point, because because next we kind of need to touch on the different types of insider threats, because as I kind of touched on in the very beginning of the episode, there's not like a one size fits all thing for insider threats, right? Like there's a bunch of variability there. So the first one, and probably one of the most notorious, is the malicious insiders, or employees or contractors who intentionally steal, leak, or sabotage the company's assets because they just want to, I guess, be evil. A couple examples of this is like if a software engineer were selling trade secrets to a competitor, or a disgruntled IT admin deploying ransomware before they quit. You would be surprised how many times that's actually happened. The next one is kind of one that you also have to be mindful of, which is negligence. So essentially, well-meaning employees mistakenly make security mistakes, which could lead to breaches. So, examples of this is they get a phishing email to their work account and they accidentally click on it, and that ends up, releasing some malware on their system, and bada bing, bada boom. Reusing passwords, sending sensitive documents to the wrong recipient, kind of things like this, which you don't necessarily intend to do, but can happen. Or like a finance team member storing unencrypted customer data on a personal Google Drive. You would be surprised how many cases of people putting like sensitive data to their organization like on personal devices. It's kind of wild how many times that has actually happened. Then kind of like the third and final one that I wanted to touch on is compromised insiders. So essentially employees or accounts or credentials that have been hacked or misused by outsiders. So kind of an example here is if a hacker were stealing an employee's VPN credentials and then using them to gain access to internal systems, or using some kind of social engineering attack to fake an IT support call in order to have the employee reveal like a password or something. So those are kind of some of the types of insider threats that you might come across. Now, I guess the next thing we have to go into is why do these insider threats happen? Now, this is kind of where you get to a bunch of kind of ambiguity, and it's a very case-by-case thing, but there are some kind of general ideas that kind of keep cropping up as these insider threats keep getting revealed, I guess. So in order to understand and how to prevent insider threats from happening, you first have to understand how and why insiders can turn into threats in order to prevent it. Now, one of the most common ones is financial motivation, right? Like an employee sells or is tempted to sell their corporate data to another company for profit, or that's happened on numerous occasions where government officials get bribed by either some kind of company or some other governmental agency to provide, top secret or some other kind of classified information. And you kind of see that they have the incentive of, someone's trying to give them a lot of money for this type of data. So that's one of the common motivations. Another one, which we've kind of already touched on and kind of hinted at, was a disgruntlement or a revenge reason. So kind of an example, like, if some employee was laid off or they didn't feel appreciated at the company, they might turn against the company. An example of this was there was a case with Tesla back in 2021 where a Tesla employee essentially leaked trade secrets because they apparently didn't like being assigned to the new role that they were put in. And this is kind of where I talked about some of the traffic might actually look legitimate depending on, what the employee was doing, since essentially what they did was they wrote a program to periodically export gigabytes worth of company data on multiple different systems by belonging to various Tesla employees. So obviously, if you have very periodic, not all happening at once across multiple systems, it's a lot harder to kind of pinpoint that down as, hey, maybe that's an insider threat of someone trying to exfiltrate data, compared to if this guy just all at once, sent off tons and tons of data from his, work laptop or whatever, off into the ether or wherever he was sending it. So this had the added effect of having that data continue to be exfiltrated even after he left, because he deployed it across other employees' devices as well. Another example of this is there was an incident where a Cisco employee deleted over 16,000 WebEx accounts, since essentially the Cisco engineer was fired, and then they just decided, for whatever reason, out of spite for losing their job, to just delete a bunch of different accounts. And then the next one is kind of we touched on is accidental leaks or negligence. So many breaches that aren't intentionally malicious usually come through some kind of human error. Now, whether that's clicking on a phishing link or reusing passwords, and say your password to Facebook or whatever, use the same password for that as you do for like company assets, which you definitely shouldn't be doing, but you'd be surprised. Say there is a Facebook data breach, hackers get your password, they try to log into your corporate accounts, somehow they get access, and there you go. Now, another example of this was there was an incident with NASA back in 2018 where a stolen employee laptop, they were basically able to exfiltrate a bunch of sensitive data from that laptop because the laptop was actually powered on. So this kind of goes back to something we've touched about before on the podcast, which is not letting your encryption work for you. Since the whole point of encrypting your disk on a laptop is so that your data stays protected. But the problem is once you boot up your laptop or even desktop for that matter, your drive gets decrypted. So if your drive is in a decrypted state when the laptop in this case is taken from you, the encryption isn't going to do jack squat because the drive is already decrypted. Now, your only hope is that maybe the system dies before they can get into it, and then the drive would essentially re-encrypt itself, and you'd have to reboot it up to decrypt it. But again, yeah, that's kind of a prime example of not letting your encryption work for you. And another thing that you also have to be mindful of too, especially depending on how big your organization is the risk from third parties. So things like contractors, vendors, temporary workers, or basically anyone that's not from technically within your organization that also has access to the infrastructure of your organization and may or may not be as well monitored depending on what assets they're using. Now, a good example of this was back in 2013. There was an incident with Target where attackers stole over 40 million credit card numbers. And the way that they did this was basically compromising an HVAC contractor's network credentials and in order to get access to Target's corporate network. So as we'll kind of discuss later, this is why zero trust is so important and why just because someone is on your network doesn't mean that they should be inherently trusted and be given access to whatever they want to have access to. Because this right here is an example of, someone's credentials got, stolen, and they were basically using those credentials to impersonate this contractor in order to gain access to things. So then, of course, after they gained access to the network, they were then able to spread malware to all the various point of sale systems and then thus steal the credit card numbers. So then we kind of touched on, some different types of insider threats and how they can happen, but how do you actually detect them and stop them? So it's a lot, stopping insider threats is of course a lot harder than stopping external hackers because obviously the insiders are already inside of your network. So any kind of network control monitoring systems used, like intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, firewalls, all that good stuff, is basically already bypassed at this point if they're already inside the network. But one thing you can do is something like user behavior analytics and anomaly detection. I think at this point, a lot of at least the bigger corporations out there kind of have something like this on there to basically monitor activity on the various corporate devices, just to kind of monitor activity. Because obviously, if you see a login from some user at 3 a.m. in a different country, probably a good indication that that's not actually them. Now, of course, I guess there's a chance that they might be traveling on vacation or something, and they decided to check their work account for whatever reason. But that would be a prime example of something you'd probably want to flag by one of these user behavior analytics type tools. Another one would be tracking large data transfers. Now, this is kind of where it gets a little iffy depending on what your role entails. Like if you're, say, like a software dev, for instance, and part of your role is, working on like high volume, data transfers as like part of your daytime job, it would be a lot harder for them to detect you exfiltrating data in that manner because you're obviously always sending out a lot of data. But for like an employee that doesn't necessarily fall into that use case, them downloading large amounts of customer data or sending out a lot of data to somewhere else would probably be a pretty big red flag. Then another one would be detecting privilege escalation attempts. So, of course, it kind of, you have to go back to principle of least privilege, of course. But that's not to say that, an insider threat could, look over someone's shoulder, see them typing in an admin password, and then on their system try to elevate their privileges with that same admin password in order to gain extra credentials on their system. So kind of an example is if someone that obviously shouldn't have admin access to their system, like maybe someone in HR or finance or whatever, then all of a sudden has elevated their privileges to admin, that's probably a good sign that something fishy might be going on. The next one is what's kind of known as the canary trick, which essentially you create the point of this, or the idea behind it is you create some sort of fake file that looks very enticing for someone that would want to be an insider threat, whether that's salary information, whether that's like business analytics, or maybe you make it seem like there's a lot of good proprietary data that someone might want to steal. And you basically monitor who tries to access that fake file in order to kind of maybe give you an inclination that someone may be up to some suspicious stuff, and maybe you put them on like a watch list or something. Now, of course, if you see like a random file that piques your interest, just because you click on it, of course, doesn't necessarily mean you're trying to, you're an insider threat and you're trying to steal data. But it could potentially indicate some possible unauthorized snooping. Now, another example, kind of in the same vein, is if you are suspicious that someone in a particular group is potentially leaking information, what you could do is you could send everyone kind of in this group slightly different information. So then you figure out, when the data actually does leak, you figure out which, part of the, I guess, the lie, if you will, got leaked out. And then you're like, oh, I only gave that version to this person, so therefore they're the person that's leaking the data. So that would potentially be another way that you can detect insider threats. Another one is kind of like endpoint and data loss prevention tools. So this is things like, blocking unauthorized USB usage, using things like personal email accounts on like corporate devices to like try to send stuff to yourself, or using some kind of like cloud storage that isn't authorized by the company, things like that. So a good example of this is like an employee trying to like email either company code or financial data or something to their personal Gmail account, and then the system would be able to flag that as, hey, probably shouldn't be doing this. And then, as we've discussed before, though, USB restrictions aren't exactly foolproof. You can see my episode where I exploited a USB restriction once. That was from the episode Ventura Install Take 2 GitHub Copilot Lawsuit Updates, Bypassing Corporate USB Restrictions, Operation Core Dump, and that was from episode 42. Okay, so we talked about some of the ways that insider threats happen, and we talked about how to detect them, but how do we prevent them? And as I kind of alluded, one of the best ways to prevent insider threats is implementing the principle of least privilege, obviously, and the zero trust model. Because preventing something from happening is a lot easier than trying to do damage control after something has already happened. So, of course, I don't think I need to go in super deep on the principle of least privilege. We've touched on this many times before in the podcast, but essentially employees should only have the minimum access needed to do their job. So example here is like if you're a junior developer, or any junior developer, if they don't need access to the production database, then obviously they shouldn't have access to it. Similarly, someone in like finance or HR almost certainly doesn't need to have admin access on their laptop or desktop or whatever they're using, so don't give it to them. If someone doesn't specifically need access to a certain directory on like a network attached storage, don't give them access to it, things like this. But the kind of going back to the zero trust model is, even though someone has already authenticated themselves, there should also be additional layers of authentication required in order to basically add more levels of restriction. Because as we touched on with some of those example cases, someone like the target case, for instance, the reason why they were able to gain all the access they had was they were already on the network and supposedly trusted through this HVAC worker contractor's account. And because they were already on the network, they basically just kind of assumed that this is, they can, kind of have free reign. So essentially, the point of zero trust is to, even if someone is already connected through the corporate VPN, they basically shouldn't have free range of the network, and they still need to authenticate themselves, and of course reduce their access to things of what they actually need to have, of course ensuring the principle of least privilege and basically mitigating as much access as you can to users so they don't have access to more than what they actually need. Another one that is also important is something either automated offboarding or some way of quickly removing credential access when somebody leaves your company. Since one of the biggest mistakes that companies can make when someone leaves the company is not removing or delaying the deactivation of their accounts, because if you don't deactivate their accounts immediately, it is theoretically possible that they could still use those credentials to gain access to your systems, even though they should no longer have access anymore, and do whatever they wanted to do. So for instance, if you have like VPN access, you obviously should be that would probably be one of the first things you would want to disable, just so any former employees couldn't remote in with their same credentials. Maybe they use their own like client or whatever, but remote in to the corporate network or whatever with those credentials, because you forgot to disable them right away. So having some kind of automated system that once a user either leaves the company, gets fired, retires, whatever the case may be, basically disable and remove their accounts like automatically. So the next one is probably the most boring one, which is training and just kind of general security awareness. Now, I think most corporations and organizations probably have some sort of insider threat training at this point. But let's be honest, how many people actually pay attention during those mandatory trainings? But the kind of the big things that you want to emphasize here is proper training, of course. Like if you just have a very automated, monotonous training, people probably aren't going to pay attention. Let's be honest. But the kind of the key topics you want to be hitting on in one of those trainings is things like being able to recognize phishing and social engineering attacks. We've kind of touched on that on the podcast on various cybersecurity tips, verifying things like who the email is coming from, verifying the link before you click on it, making sure the link is actually going to the domain that it claims to be going to, things like this, inspecting things. And then, of course, why personal devices shouldn't store company data. Now, personally, I am a very big fan of not mixing work and pleasure, in the sense that I don't log into any of my personal accounts on my work devices, and I don't log into any of my work accounts on my personal devices. And part of that is if not logging into personal accounts on work devices means they can't spy on me that way. But also not having company data, including things like emails, Slack, or whatever, on your personal device means that it allows you, one, to set boundaries between yourself and work, which is pretty important. But also in a scenario where maybe like highly sensitive information gets sent out through one of those channels, you don't have to worry about viewing it in a place that you shouldn't, like maybe you're in public. You don't have to worry about, say, like opening Slack and seeing like some sensitive company data or whatever just kind of chilling there, that someone looking over your shoulder might be like, that's some pretty interesting stuff. Also, you don't have to worry about your organization potentially wanting to confiscate your personal device if there was some kind of data that got sent out that you maybe technically weren't supposed to see or have on that device. So it just kind of removes that. So the next kind of thing I wanted to touch on is kind of like background checks and kind of like ongoing monitoring. So as much as someone that is very privacy focused hates the idea of, being monitored, that is kind of one thing that you do kind of have to give up if you want to work for a company. It's they have these massive contracts and whatnot. But essentially from the corporate perspective, you're just protecting your best interest in your bottom line. So I think it's fairly typical these days for like when you first do like try to apply for a job that there'll be some kind of background check process. How extensive that is can vary from company to company. Um, but then, of course, kind of like a recurring and ongoing process of watching for sudden behavior or changes in like your normal day-to-day routine. If you suddenly become more withdrawn or hostile in the workplace, that might potentially be cause for alarm of an insider threat. And then the last thing I wanted to kind of touch on for this episode is probably one of the most famous cases of insider threats out there, which is the good old Snowden leaks. Now, whether you are a fan of Snowden and think what he did was good for the general public or you think he's a traitor, we're not here to discuss that. We're basically just go into essentially the kind of the some of the details of the case. Um, so so of course, obviously, he was an insider threat. He basically leaked a bunch of NSA data, and which, due to the beautiful nature of the internet and anything you post on it being forever, all of Snowden's leaked top secret information is basically out there for anyone to see whenever they want to. Now, I'm not going to tell you where or how to go about getting it, but what I will say is you don't necessarily have to use any kind of torrenting software if you don't want to. And hypothetically speaking, if you did have Git installed, which I'm assuming most of you probably do, you could download some of his information right now, allegedly anyway. Basically, the story of Snowden is he was a contractor for the United States government as basically an IT admin. And basically, because of permissions and whatnot, he had access to a bunch of systems that, if we're being honest, he never should have had access to, thus giving him access to all the various highly classified documents that he got access to. So, because he was a sysadmin and due to the lack of access controls, he basically had broad access to all the various internal systems. So kind of the big lesson here is just because someone is an IT admin doesn't mean they should have basically free reign to access whatever they want. So what went wrong with the NSA's access control policies? Well, I guess kind of a couple of things. The first was they didn't have the best internal security in the sense that they didn't properly separate data access by job role. So kind of as we touched on, Snowden was a sysadmin, so he basically, I guess, the NSA at the time, because he was a sysadmin, basically allowed him to do whatever he wanted. So he could essentially laterally move across various classified networks, escalating his privileges without really triggering any alarms because, again, he's a sysadmin, so he kind of has to do that stuff in order to ensure the health of the network and whatnot, and make sure systems are properly updated and all that good stuff. So this is kind of going back to the zero trust model, where and kind of network segmentation is principle of least privilege. Basically making sure that just because you're a sysadmin doesn't necessarily mean you should have access to all the data on the systems. Now, of course, you're going to need access to the systems in order to, say, do updates on them, but you don't necessarily need to have access to the data that's on said systems. Now, it does get kind of tricky in the sense that depending on if you're escalating your privileges to, say, root on like a Linux system, that basically gives you free reign over everything to kind of bypass stuff. So it does get kind of tricky in that sense. But also the other thing that was kind of a missed opportunity was the fact that Snowden downloaded enormous amounts of data, which also didn't trigger any alarms. Which is also kind of another big red flag that you might have an insider threat on your hands. Now, modern cybersecurity tools like the various user behavior analytics we kind of talked about would theoretically flag these kinds of anomalies. And that's kind of one thing that as an organization you'd want to monitor for is unusual access of data, like large file transfers, high privilege users accessing files that have no relation to what their job title is, like in Snowden's case, off hours activity, like why is this person, constantly accessing, the corporate network at like 12 a.m. to like 3 a.m., things like that. So I guess kind of getting into how some of these mistakes could have been prevented. Kind of as we touched on, the over reliance on trust instead of verification. So basically, because Snowden was a cleared government contractor and he was a sysadmin, they basically just kind of let him have access to all the internal systems and not, properly implementing the zero trust and always verifying his actual access for things that he was trying to access. Of course, the weak data exfiltration controls, being able to copy this classified information onto a USB drive and other various external drives probably should have raised some red flags. And having the NSA actually enforce data loss prevention that would have blocked these USB devices in the first place could have also potentially mitigated the leak here. And then not effectively logging user account activity and auditing those logs, because you can have some of the best logs in the world, but if you don't monitor those logs to see what's going on, they're basically useless. It's kind of like having a backup that you never test. It's basically useless. You always want to be testing your backups. You always want to, be checking the logs, checking for things like anomalies. Now, if you have some kind of automation or some kind of tool that monitors those logs automatically for you and kind of alerts you, that's potentially one way you could do it. But there really was no kind of alerts raised when Snowden was doing these unusual file accesses, and there were no like auditing tools to audit the various actions he was taking in order, which potentially could have had him get caught sooner. So I guess kind of the key takeaways from this episode is the fact that insider threats are more dangerous than external hacks, from the sense that they're coming from trusted users. Now, whether that account is compromised or not, I mean, that obviously plays a role, but the fact is the user that is doing essentially that is being the threat is on the inside. Their accountants and whatnot have technically already been vetted. It's not like there's a remote threat actor like breaking through your firewall to gain access to stuff. And detecting them can potentially be challenging. But if using a mix of, these user behavior analytics and data loss prevention tools, and policies like least privilege, rapid offboarding, and kind of some of those other things we talked about, can definitely help prevent insider threats from happening. But again, there is no silver bullet when it comes to cybersecurity. If there were, everyone would be using it. All of these different things, like I like to say, are just different layers of Swiss cheese, all put on top of one of each other, which the hope is that you have enough layers of Swiss cheese layered on top of each other that there are no big noticeable holes that someone can easily get through. But the other thing we also have to keep in mind, too, is the fact that a lot of these instances also are due to negligence, not necessarily malice. So, ensuring that employees are kind of aware of some of the things that potentially can happen from negligence, things like phishing emails and that kind of a thing, is also important to keep in mind as well. So I think that's basically going to do it for this episode. Kind of talked a lot about insider threats. I think it's an episode that has kind of been much needed since how much we've kind of touched on them, but never really got into it. So hopefully this kind of gives you either a better understanding of what insider threats are, or is a nice refresher for you. But before we go, let's get back to our trivia question for the week, which is: a SIM card is an integrated circuit intended to securely store information and a key on a mobile phone. But what does SIM in SIM card stand for? If you said subscriber identity module, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review, and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. And definitely be sure to share with a friend or family member. We touched on some pretty good stuff in this one. And if you have any questions about this episode or of any topics or ideas for future episodes, definitely shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or you can leave a link or leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube. That works as well. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.